Paul lived on the far edge of the human colony, where the houses thinned out and the land stretched wide with dry fields. His shelter was simple, built from local stone and reinforced with metal sheets he had collected over the years. He liked the quiet. The colony center was always noisy, filled with machines and voices, but here at the edge he could hear the wind and the calls of small creatures that hid in the grass at night. That evening, he was fixing the broken hinge of his door when he heard something unusual. It was not the sound of the wind or the call of an animal. It was faint, soft, almost like a whimper. Paul paused, tools in hand, and listened carefully. At first he thought he imagined it, but then it came again, a weak cry carried by the wind. He stood, his eyes scanning the field. Nothing moved except the long grass bending under the breeze. His first thought was that it could be a wounded animal, but something in that sound felt different. It carried pain, but also a tone that reminded him of a child. Paul set his tools aside and stepped off his porch. His boots pressed into the dirt as he walked toward the sound. Each step made him more alert, more curious, and slightly uneasy. He had lived alone for many seasons, and visitors rarely came this far unless they had business. When he reached a cluster of rocks near the edge of the field, he saw her. A small figure lay half hidden behind the stones. She was curled tightly, her thin arms around her knees. Her skin had a faint pale glow under the fading sun, unlike human skin, and her hair was silvery white even though she looked young. Her clothes were torn, no more than scraps of fabric. Paul froze in place. This was no human child. The girl opened, her eyes slowly when she sensed him. They were large and bright, a strange mix of green and gold. She blinked at him with fear, but too weak to move away. Paul hesitated. He had heard stories about aliens passing near the colony. Most people treated them with suspicion, saying they could be dangerous. But looking at the girl, he did not see danger. He saw hunger, exhaustion, and fear. "Hey," Paul said gently, keeping his voice calm. "Can you hear me?" The girl tried to speak, but only a weak sound escaped her lips. She trembled, her hands shaking as if even the act of breathing took strength. Paul crouched down, keeping some distance so he would not frighten her. He slowly reached into the pouch on his belt and pulled out a piece of dried bread he had kept from his meal. He placed it on the ground near her, then stepped back. Her eyes followed the bread. For a moment, she did not move, as if unsure whether it was safe. Then, with slow effort, she stretched her thin fingers and pulled the bread toward her. She bit into it, her teeth small but sharp. She chewed slowly, swallowing with difficulty. Paul watched silently. The girl ate as if she had not seen food in days. He waited until she finished, then offered her a flask of water. He placed it near the rock, just within her reach. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. When she drank, the water dripped down her chin, but she kept drinking until the flask was half empty. Only then did she lower it and look at him again. Paul studied her face. She could not be more than 8 or 9 years old if judged by human measure. Her cheeks were hollow, her arms thin as sticks. He wondered how far she had traveled to end up here, alone and starving. "You're safe here," Paul said quietly, though he knew she might not understand his words. Still, tone mattered more than language. The girl's eyes softened a little. She shifted, as if trying to sit up straighter. Her lips moved, forming a sound that was almost a word. But it was not one Paul understood. Still, her effort told him something important. She was trying to connect. Night was falling, and the air was cooling fast. Paul looked at the girl and made a choice. He could not leave her here. Whatever her origin, she was just a child in need. "I'll carry you back," he said softly. He extended his arms slowly so she could see his intention. At first she tensed, shrinking back, but when her body shook from weakness, she gave the smallest nod. Paul lifted her carefully. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel the sharpness of her bones through the thin fabric of her clothes. Her head rested against his chest, her breath shallow but steady. As he walked back to his shelter, the girl's eyes remained half open, watching him as if trying to understand who he was. When they reached the door, he laid her gently on a small cot near the fire. He covered her with a blanket and placed more food within her reach. For a while, he sat nearby, silent, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint sound of her breathing. Questions filled his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she alone? He had no answers, but one thing was clear. Tonight, she would not starve. Paul leaned back in his chair, eyes on the girl. In all his years on the colony, he had never expected that one simple act, sharing food, would open a door to something greater. But as he watched her, he sensed that this was only the beginning. The night deepened, and stars filled the sky outside. Inside the small shelter, a quiet bond had begun to form between a solitary human and a starving alien child who had stumbled into his life. The next morning, when Paul woke, the cot near his fire was empty. The blanket lay folded neatly, and the little girl was gone. For a long moment he stood in silence, staring at the empty space. He checked the door. It was not forced. She must have left quietly in the night. He stepped outside, scanning the open field. There were faint tracks in the dirt leading toward the trees. Paul rubbed his jaw. He felt a strange emptiness. He had not even asked her name, had not learned anything about where she had come from. He hoped she had found her people. Life returned to routine. Days passed. Paul worked on fixing the water pump behind his shelter. He chopped wood, tended to the small vegetable patch, and tried not to think too much about the thin, pale child with golden-green eyes. Still, at night, when the wind blew against the roof, he found himself wondering if she was safe. On the fourth evening, as he was preparing a small meal, he heard a sound outside. It was not the faint whimper he had heard before, but a different sound. 2 sets of steps, soft but uneven, approaching from the field. Paul stiffened. He reached for the tool he often kept near the door, not as a weapon but out of habit. When he opened the door, he froze. The little girl was back. She stood near the edge of the porch, her silvery hair catching the dim light. But she was not alone. Beside her was a taller figure, a woman who looked worn and weary, yet carried herself with quiet dignity. The woman's skin had the same faint glow as the child's, though her face was sharper and her eyes carried deep lines of hardship. Her clothes were torn, patched together with pieces of fabric, and her arm was wrapped around her daughter protectively. The girl smiled faintly when she saw Paul, as if she had been certain he would still be here. She tugged at her mother's hand, guiding her closer. Paul stepped aside. "Come in," he said simply. The woman hesitated at the threshold. Her eyes scanned the inside of the shelter, cautious, measuring. Finally, she gave a small nod and stepped in with her daughter. Paul closed the door behind them. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting light over the room. The woman guided the girl to sit near the cot, then turned her attention to Paul. She placed her hand on her chest and spoke a single word. "Mira." Paul understood. Her name. He pointed to himself. "Paul." Her eyes softened with recognition. She gave a slight bow of her head. Then she touched the girl's shoulder. "Lena." So that was the child's name. Paul looked at her. Lena was thin still, but not as weak as before. She gave him a shy smile and whispered something in her own tongue. Paul crouched down, offering them both some bread and a bowl of soup. Mira watched him closely, then accepted. She gave the bread to Lena first, then took a small piece for herself. They ate slowly, savoring every bite. Silence filled the room for a while, broken only by the sound of spoons against bowls. Paul did not rush to ask questions. He knew they might not understand him, and he did not want to frighten them. Instead, he let the quiet act of sharing food speak for itself. After the meal, Mira looked at Paul, her eyes steady. She pointed to Lena, then to herself, then placed her hand flat on the table as if asking for something permanent. Paul studied her, unsure at first. Slowly, the meaning came to him. They wanted to stay. Paul leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. He had not expected this. Helping a child for one night was one thing. Taking in both mother and daughter was another. The colony had rules. Strangers, especially aliens, were to be reported. Shelter, food, water, all were tightly watched by the patrols. But when Paul looked at Lena, who was sitting quietly with her hands folded, her bright eyes full of hope, he felt the same pull he had felt the night he first found her. She was alive because he had helped her. Now, her mother had come, trusting him enough to bring her here. He exhaled slowly. "You can stay for now," he said softly, knowing they would not understand the words, but perhaps the tone. Mira gave a small nod, as if she had caught his meaning. She reached out and touched his arm briefly, a gesture of thanks. The days that followed were unlike anything Paul had known before. Mira was quiet, but skilled. She repaired torn clothing with fine stitches using scraps of cloth Paul had kept. She cleaned tools and arranged supplies neatly. Lena, meanwhile, followed Paul, around like a shadow. She was curious about everything, his tools, his cooking, the small vegetable garden outside. Though they could not speak the same language, small gestures became their way of communication. A smile, a nod, a hand pointing to an object. Slowly, trust grew. One evening, as the three of them sat by the fire, Paul noticed how different the shelter felt. It was no longer just stone walls and wood. It felt alive, warmed not just by the fire, but by the quiet presence of two beings who had found safety here. But deep down, Paul knew this peace could not last forever. The colony patrols were thorough. Strangers left traces, and if anyone discovered Mira and Lena, questions would follow. For now, though, he chose not to think about it. For now, it was enough that they were safe, fed, and no longer alone. Lena leaned against her mother, her eyes half closed, a faint smile on her face. Mira watched her daughter with quiet relief, then looked at Paul across the fire. In her gaze, Paul saw both gratitude and something else. Hope. It was in that moment he realized, by feeding a starving little girl, he had stepped into a story far greater than his own. The days turned into a week. For Paul, life no longer followed the quiet, steady rhythm it once had. His small shelter was now alive with new sounds. The soft laughter of Lena as she tried to copy his work, the gentle voice of Mira when she guided her daughter, and the steady movement of two extra pairs of hands helping with daily chores. Though words were hard to share, Paul and Mira found ways to understand each other. A simple gesture, a look, or even the tone of a voice often carried more meaning than sentences. Slowly, piece by piece, Paul began to learn about their past. One morning, as he prepared the garden beds for planting, Mira came outside carrying a strip of cloth. She sat down beside him and began drawing symbols on the dirt with a stick. Her movements were careful, her eyes fixed on the shapes. Paul leaned closer. She drew a large circle, then smaller shapes within it, almost like stars. Her hand moved, tracing a path between them. Finally, she drew a jagged mark across the circle and looked at him with sad eyes. Paul studied the drawing. He realized she was trying to show him something about her people. The large circle might have been a planet or a home world. The jagged line cutting across it, destruction. Mira placed her hand on her chest and spoke a word softly, almost like a sigh. Paul did not understand the word, but the emotion was clear. Loss. Lena, who was nearby, bent down and added her own marks to the dirt. She drew small stick figures, scattered, some far from the circle. Paul looked at her drawing, then back at Mira. Slowly, the truth formed in his mind. They were survivors. Their home had been destroyed, their people scattered across the stars. Paul felt a heavy weight in his chest. He had lived through hardship himself. The colony was not easy. Every day required work, patience, and endurance. But he had always had shelter, food, and the protection of his own people. Mira and Lena had none of that. They had fled, alone and without help, until hunger drove them to his door. That night, while Lena slept on the cot, Paul and Mira sat quietly near the fire. She pointed at him, then to Lena, then back to herself. She spoke slowly, her words broken. "But he caught enough. You, help! Lena, live!" Her voice carried both gratitude and pain. Paul gave a small nod. "She was just a child," he said softly. "I couldn't let her starve." Mira tilted her head, studying his face. Then she said something else, a word she repeated twice. Paul did not know its meaning, but from the way she touched her heart, he guessed it was a word of deep thanks. As the days continued, Mira began to help more around the shelter. She mended Paul's worn coat with careful stitching, gathered firewood with surprising strength, and even showed Paul how to prepare certain wild roots that grew near the hills. Lena followed Paul everywhere, her laughter brightening the small home. Yet peace was fragile. One afternoon, while Paul was checking his traps near the stream, he heard voices in the distance. 2 men from the colony patrol were moving along the edge of the field. They spoke loudly, their words carried by the wind. "Tracks near this side again," one of them said. "Something's been here. Could be smugglers." Paul crouched low, heart pounding. He watched as the patrolmen studied the ground, then moved farther east. Only when they were gone did he breathe again. That evening he said nothing to Mira or Lena, but he knew the truth. The colony was beginning to notice signs. If anyone discovered that he was hiding outsiders, there would be questions, and those questions would lead to danger. Later that night, Mira must have sensed his unease. She touched his arm lightly and gave him a searching look. Paul sighed, leaning back in his chair. "They're looking," he said, though he knew she did not understand the words. But she seemed to understand his tone, for her eyes lowered, in worry. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Mira lifted her head and spoke quietly. She told him a string of words in her language, her voice low but steady. Though he could not understand, the meaning was clear in her gaze. She did not want him to risk himself. Paul shook his head. "You're safe here," he said firmly. Mira watched him for a long time, then gave a small nod. Her eyes held something. New now, not just gratitude, but trust. The next morning, Lena came to Paul with a small stone she had polished until it shone. She pressed it into his hand, smiling. "Paul," she said softly, her voice careful but clear. Paul blinked, surprised. It was the first time she had spoken his name. He smiled faintly, closing his hand around the stone. "Lena," he replied. Her eyes lit up, and she laughed before running back to her mother. Mira smiled too, her face softer than he had seen before. For Paul, that small moment carried more weight than words could measure. The girl he had saved was no longer just a guest in his home. She was becoming part of his life, a bond growing stronger each day. Still, he could not ignore the shadow creeping closer. The colony patrols would not stop searching. Tracks could be found again, questions asked, suspicions raised. As he sat by the fire that night, the stone Lena had given him resting in his palm, Paul realized the truth. Feeding a starving child had begun something he could not turn away from. He had taken responsibility not only for Lena, but also for her mother, Mira, and perhaps for something greater, a chance to prove that humanity's strength was not only in survival, but in compassion. And though danger grew closer with every passing day, Paul felt no regret. For the first time in years, his small shelter was not just a place to live. It was a home. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, yet Paul could feel the weight of change pressing down on him. He no longer lived only for himself. Mira and Lena had become part of his daily life, and though he still treasured silence, he no longer felt alone, but the colony was not blind. One afternoon, as Paul worked outside repairing the fence near his vegetable patch, a shadow fell across the ground. He turned and saw two men on horseback. Both wore the gray coats of the colony patrol. Dust covered their boots, and rifles hung by their sides. "Paul," one of them called, "you've been out here a long time. Any trouble?" Paul wiped his hands on a cloth and shook his head. "No trouble, just keeping things running." The patrolmen exchanged a look. The older one leaned forward on his saddle. "We found tracks near the hills, light steps, not human boots. Could be smugglers or worse." Paul kept his face calm, though his chest tightened. "I've seen animals near the stream," he said smoothly. "They can leave strange tracks." The younger patrolman frowned. "Animals don't cut across fences the way these did. If you see anything unusual, you need to report it." Paul nodded slowly. "Of course." The men lingered, their eyes sweeping over his land. Paul stood steady, refusing to show unease. Finally, the older one gave a grunt. "Be careful, Paul. Strange things have been moving near the colony. Some say outsiders are sneaking in." With that, they turned their horses and rode off. Dust rose in their wake, settling slowly over the quiet field. Paul exhaled, his hand tightening on the fence post. They were close, too close. If they searched more carefully, they would find signs of Mira and Lena. When he stepped inside the shelter, he found Mira and Lena waiting. Mira's eyes searched his face, reading his tension. "Patrol?" she asked, using one of the few human words she had learned. Paul gave a short nod. Mira's shoulders stiffened. She pulled Lena closer to her side. The child looked up at Paul with wide, worried eyes. "They're suspicious," Paul said quietly, though he knew Mira could only guess the meaning. "We have to be careful." Mira seemed to understand. She gave a firm nod and began tidying the small room, erasing any sign of their presence. Lena helped, though her small hands moved clumsily. By nightfall, the shelter looked as though only Paul lived there. Still, he knew patrol eyes were sharp. The next morning, Paul decided to take Mira and Lena into the hills for a time. They gathered food and water, moving before dawn. Lena clung to Paul's hand as they climbed the rocky path. Mira followed close, her eyes scanning every shadow. They reached a small hollow between two cliffs, hidden from the open fields. There, Paul built a temporary fire and set down their packs. The place was quiet, safe enough for now. As they sat around the small fire, Lena tried to copy Paul's movements as he sharpened a stick into a tool. She laughed softly when her stick snapped in half, and even Mira's lips curved into a faint smile. For a moment, the tension lifted, but peace never lasted long. Late that afternoon, Paul spotted movement far below, near the edge of the fields. The patrol had returned. 3 riders this time, moving slowly, scanning the ground. They stopped near Paul's fence and dismounted, bending to study the dirt. Paul's jaw tightened. They would see the signs, footsteps too small to be his, patterns that betrayed visitors. He crouched low, motioning Mira and Lena to stay silent. Together they watched as the patrolmen walked the field. One pointed toward the hills. The others nodded. They mounted again and began moving closer to the rocky paths. Paul's heart pounded. They were heading in their direction. He turned quickly. "We have to move," he whispered, though his voice was steady. Mira understood the urgency in his tone. She lifted Lena into her arms, and the 3 of them slipped deeper into the hills, following narrow paths that twisted between stone walls. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long. Every sound felt sharper, the scrape of boots on rock, the rustle of grass, the distant clop of hooves. At last, Paul led them into a cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. Inside, the air was cool and damp, the walls rough with stone. Mira set Lena down, who clung to her mother but stayed quiet. Paul moved to the entrance, pulling aside the vines just enough to see outside. The patrol riders were close now, their shapes moving along the path below. One of them pointed toward the ridge. "Tracks again," he said. His voice carried faintly in the still air. Paul gritted his teeth. They had found too much already. The riders moved on, slowly climbing toward the higher ground. Paul stayed frozen at the cave mouth until their shapes disappeared into the distance. Only then did he return to Mira and Lena. "They're searching harder now," he said quietly. Mira touched his hand lightly. "Danger," she said in careful English. Her eyes held worry not just for herself, but for him. Paul gave a short nod. "I know." That night, as Lena slept curled against her mother, Paul sat awake, listening to the distant sounds of patrol horns echoing across the hills. He knew it was only a matter of time before they returned. He had helped Mira and Lena, given them food and shelter. But in doing so, he had tied his fate to theirs. He thought of Lena's small smile when she had spoken his name for the first time. He thought of Mira's eyes, filled with quiet strength, despite loss and hardship. And he knew one truth: he could not hand them over. Human laws were clear. Outsiders were to be reported, judged, and often sent away. But Paul felt something deeper than law. To him, kindness was not a choice, but a responsibility. By helping them, he had already crossed a line. There was no turning back. The fire in the cave burned low, casting long shadows across the stone walls. Paul leaned against the rough rock, eyes steady on the dark entrance. The patrol might come again tomorrow or the next day, but when they did, he would be ready. The morning air was crisp in the hills, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and damp earth. Paul had been awake before dawn, listening to the distant calls of birds and the soft rustle of leaves. The patrol riders could return at any moment, and he knew he had to keep Mira and Lena moving to stay safe. He gently shook Lena awake. Her small eyes blinked open, still sleepy, and she reached for her mother. Mira had already risen, stretching lightly, her eyes sharp and alert. Paul whispered instructions as they packed the small bundle of supplies they had brought: dried roots, bread, water, and a few simple tools. "Stay close," Paul said quietly, his hand brushing Mira's. She nodded, and Lena held onto his sleeve, tightly, her small fingers gripping the fabric like a lifeline. They moved carefully along narrow paths winding through the rocky hills. The trail was steep and uneven, but Paul knew it well. Every step had to be precise. One wrong move could make noise or leave a visible track. Mira followed, her movements silent and steady, while Lena mimicked Paul's careful steps, trying not to stumble. As the sun rose higher, Paul stopped at a small clearing to let them rest. He pointed to the plants growing there, picking a few and handing them to Mira. She inspected them with a curious glance, then smiled faintly, understanding that they could eat these if necessary. Lena tugged at a leaf, tasting it, and Paul chuckled, softly. "Careful," he whispered, though Lena's bright eyes only widened in excitement. The peaceful moment lasted only a few minutes. Far below, he spotted the patrol riders moving along the valley floor. Dust rose from the horses' hooves. Their presence was unmistakable, and Paul knew they would soon climb higher if they noticed the tracks. "We must move faster," he said, his voice calm but firm. Mira's eyes met his, and she nodded. Lena squeezed his hand tightly, sensing urgency, even if she did not understand every word. The trio climbed higher, following a hidden ridge that Paul had discovered years ago. The path was narrow, with sheer drops on one side and jagged rocks on the other. It was not an easy climb, but it was safe from patrols and almost impossible for outsiders to follow. As they moved, Paul taught Mira and Lena small human survival techniques. He showed Mira how to tie a loop in a rope to make climbing easier. He showed Lena how to test rocks for stability before stepping on them. Every lesson was simple yet practical, and Mira watched closely, nodding with understanding. Lena's small hands struggled at first, but she laughed when she failed, quickly trying again. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small cave nestled in the cliffs. The entrance was narrow, almost hidden by vines and stones. Paul led them inside and set down their packs. The air was cool and safe, and for a moment, all three could breathe without fear. While Lena explored the small space, Paul and Mira spoke quietly. Mira pointed to herself, then to the path behind them, then raised her hands as if to ask what would happen if the patrol followed. Paul shook his head slowly. "They won't find us here," he said. Mira's eyes held both relief and worry. She placed her hand on his, a gesture of gratitude and trust. Paul felt a quiet warmth in his chest. He had never felt this responsibility before. It was one thing to survive alone. It was another to carry the lives of two others with him. That night, the patrol riders stopped nearby, their voices faint but clear. Paul could hear them discussing the strange tracks, speculating about outsiders moving through the hills. He held his breath as the sound drifted past, then slowly faded into the distance. When the sounds were gone, Paul lit a small fire inside the cave, careful to keep it low so smoke would not rise too high. Mira and Lena sat close to the warmth, watching him. Lena reached out and took his hand, her small fingers curling around his. Mira rested her head against her daughter, closing her eyes for a moment of relief. The next day, Paul led them further into the hills, toward a narrow valley that was overgrown with bushes and low trees. The patrol would not dare enter such thick growth, and Paul knew it could provide both cover and food. Along the way, he showed Mira how to gather edible roots and small fruits, pointing out which plants were safe to eat. She watched carefully, her eyes sharp and eager to learn. Lena followed, occasionally stopping to examine small insects or shiny stones. Paul let her explore in small bursts, knowing it would keep her spirit alive, even during danger. He explained, quietly, how humans survive by noticing small details, using what others overlook. Mira seemed impressed by his calmness and knowledge, nodding with understanding. By late afternoon, Paul found a small stream flowing through the valley. The water was clear and cool. Mira and Lena drank first, then he filled his flask. The sound of water brought a sense of calm, and for a moment, the fear of patrols faded. They rested by the stream, Paul watching the hills for movement. Every shadow could have been a rider, every sound could have been a warning. But Mira and Lena stayed close, trusting him completely. As the sun began to set, Paul led them to a hidden nook near the stream, protected by rocks and bushes. There, he built a small fire and prepared a simple meal. Mira helped, gathering twigs for the fire, while Lena carefully watched and mimicked each movement. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Paul looked at the two he had saved. Mira and Lena were not just survivors. They were learning, adapting, and beginning to trust humans in a way that their past must have made impossible. He thought about the patrols, about the danger that was never far behind. But he also thought about the strength of the human spirit, the ability to care, to teach, to protect, and to survive not by weapons, but by ingenuity and courage. The fire crackled softly. Lena leaned against her mother, eyes half closed, smiling, despite exhaustion. Mira watched her daughter, then looked at Paul. In that quiet gaze, Paul felt a bond stronger than words. He had chosen to help them, and in return he had discovered something greater, the quiet power of human kindness, the courage to protect others even at great risk. The hills around them were dark now, shadows stretching long, but inside their small hidden space there was warmth and safety. Paul knew the patrol could come again, but he also knew that with trust, knowledge, and courage, they would survive together. The morning sun rose pale and soft over the hills, casting long shadows across the rocky paths. Paul, Mira, and Lena had spent the night in their hidden nook, but they all knew that the patrol riders were still searching. Today, the danger would come closer. Paul stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the valley below. Mira held Lena's hand tightly, whispering comfort to her daughter in a voice that was calm but firm. Paul had taught them both to move quietly and watch every sound carefully. Now, they would have to act with courage. "Stay close," Paul whispered. Lena nodded, gripping his sleeve. Mira adjusted her daughter's cloak, making sure she was prepared for the day ahead. The patrol riders appeared first as small specks in the distance. Paul counted 3, moving steadily toward their hiding spot. He knew they had spotted the tracks leading up the hills. The time to hide was almost gone. Paul took a deep breath. "We can't run anymore," he said quietly. Mira's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, trusting his judgment. He would not allow them to be captured. They had come too far, survived too much, and learned too much to be turned away now. When the patrol reached the edge of the ridge, Paul stepped forward from behind a rock. He raised his hand slowly, showing no weapon. Mira followed, lifting. Lena slightly so the child could be seen but protected. The patrol stopped, their horses shifting nervously on the rocky ground. The older rider spoke first. "Paul, step aside. We know there are outsiders here. You are breaking the colony's laws by hiding them." Paul shook his head. His voice was firm, carrying across the small clearing. "I will not let you take them. They are safe here. I am responsible for them." The patrolman frowned. "That is not your decision. Outsiders must be reported. You know the rules." "I know the rules," Paul said, his gaze steady. "But I also know what is right. They are not dangerous. They are just living beings who need help." Mira stepped forward slightly, holding Lena close. Her voice was quiet, but Paul saw the determination in her eyes. Even without knowing his language, she made it clear. She trusted him, and she would follow his lead. The younger patrolman shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Sir, maybe we should just bring them in," he said. "We can explain later." The older one shook his head. "No, rules are rules. We can't ignore this." Paul's heart pounded, but he stayed calm. He knew he had only one chance to make them understand. "Look at them," he said. "They are alive because someone cared. If you take them away, they could die. That is not justice." The patrolman looked at Mira and Lena. The mother and daughter stood quietly, eyes wide but calm. Lena clutched her mother's hand, and for the first time, Paul noticed the strength in both of them, not in their muscles, but in their spirit. The older rider glanced at his companion, then back at Paul. His eyes softened slightly. "We follow orders," he said slowly. "But maybe there is more than rules. Maybe sometimes humans must choose kindness over law." Paul held his gaze. "That is all I ask. Let them stay. They are not a threat." For a long moment, silence stretched across the ridge. The wind rustled leaves and grass, carrying the faint scent of the earth. Lena stepped forward slightly, her small voice breaking the tension. "Paul," she said softly, her words careful but clear. The patrolman looked at her. Mira smiled faintly, a quiet nod encouraging her daughter. The older rider's jaw tightened, then he gave a slow nod of acknowledgement. "Stay here," he said finally. "We will report, but we will not take them today." Paul exhaled quietly, relief washing over him. Mira hugged Lena tightly, both of them smiling softly at him. Paul felt warmth spread through his chest. The moment of danger had passed, but the lesson was clear. The strength of humans was not only in their rules or weapons, it was in courage, compassion, and the choice to protect those who cannot protect themselves. For the rest of the day, Paul, Mira, and Lena stayed in the clearing, careful to remain hidden but also savoring the sense of safety. Paul showed Mira how to gather fresh water from a small spring nearby and how to collect edible roots and berries without leaving signs for the patrol. Lena helped, her bright eyes absorbing every new skill, learning as quickly as a child could. That evening, Paul built a fire near the rock walls, careful to keep it low. Mira and Lena sat close, sharing the warmth. Paul gave Lena a piece of bread, and she smiled brightly, holding it up to show him how much it meant. Mira watched them both quietly, then looked at Paul. She placed her hand gently on his arm, a silent gesture of thanks and trust. Paul smiled, feeling the bond between them grow stronger. He realized that this small act of protection, standing against the patrol, risking himself for others, had created something deeper than survival. It had created family, connection, and trust. As night fell, the firelight flickered across their faces. Paul thought about the future. The patrol would continue searching, questions would be asked, but he felt ready. Not because of weapons or numbers, but because of the courage and determination that grew in him and in Mira and Lena. In that quiet night, high in the hills, Paul understood something fundamental. Humans could be strong in many ways, not just with tools or power, but with heart, wisdom, and bravery. By choosing to protect those who could not protect themselves, they showed a strength that even outsiders recognized. Lena fell asleep against her mother, her small hand holding Mira's tightly. Mira rested her head against Paul's shoulder for a moment, then closed her eyes. Paul stayed awake longer, watching the stars appear in the sky. He felt a quiet pride. He had taken a stand. He had defended the weak, chosen compassion over fear, and protected lives that depended on him. And in doing so, he had shown the patrol, and perhaps the entire colony, that humanity's greatest strength lay not in power or law, but in courage, kindness, and the willingness to stand for what is right. The night stretched on, peaceful and quiet. For now, they were safe. But more than that, they were together. And that, Paul realized, was the most powerful thing of all. The morning sun rose slowly, painting the hills in gold and soft pink. Paul, Mira, and Lena had spent the night hidden in their small rock nook. Though the danger from the patrol still lingered, it felt lighter now. Yesterday's stand had shown. Paul, that courage and kindness could hold their ground even against rules and fear. Paul stretched and looked at the two he had saved. Mira was already awake, brushing Lena's hair gently. The child's eyes blinked open, still sleepy, but the bright smile that followed warmed Paul's heart. Lena tugged on Paul's sleeve, pointing toward the ridge above them, signaling her readiness for the day's journey. "We need to move carefully," Paul said softly, though the words were more for Mira than Lena. He knew the patrol would continue, searching, but he also knew the hidden paths and valleys better than anyone. Mira nodded, holding Lena's hand tightly. Paul led them along a narrow path that wound between cliffs and dense trees. Every step was deliberate, every pause a moment to scan the valley below. The patrol had not yet returned, but Paul knew they could appear at any moment. By mid-morning, they reached a small clearing near a stream that Paul had discovered years ago. The water was fresh and clear, flowing gently over smooth stones. Paul knelt to drink, cupping his hands, and offered the same to Mira and Lena. The small gesture brought comfort, a reminder of the simple joys of life that danger could not take. Mira watched Paul carefully, her eyes softening with trust and gratitude. She handed Lena a small piece of bread, and the child's bright eyes sparkled as she bit into it. Paul smiled, feeling a quiet pride. "Today we find a safe place," Paul said quietly. Mira nodded, understanding the intent even if not every word made sense. Lena, holding her mother's hand, followed closely, learning not just survival skills, but also the courage of standing together. They moved deeper into the hills, through narrow paths and hidden valleys. Paul taught Mira how to test the ground for safety, how to notice small details in the plants and stones, and how to leave minimal tracks for the patrol to follow. Lena tried to copy every motion, laughing softly when she stumbled but quickly, getting up and trying again. By afternoon, they reached a larger cave, hidden behind thick vines and rocks. Paul had known of this place for years. It was safe, concealed, and had a small opening to the outside for fresh air. He set down their packs and began arranging a small living area with blankets and gathered supplies. Mira watched and helped, moving with quiet efficiency. Lena explored the cave, her small voice humming softly as she tested each corner. As evening approached, Paul gathered dry twigs and branches to light a small fire. The warmth spread quickly, and the trio settled near it. Mira fed Lena a small meal while Paul prepared a simple dish for himself. The firelight reflected in their eyes, casting shadows on the walls, but inside there was safety and calm. Paul thought about the past weeks, the night he had first found Lena, the days spent hiding and teaching, and the moments of fear when the patrol had come close. Each challenge had shown him something important, that humans were capable not just of survival, but of compassion, courage, and protection. Lena climbed into Paul's lap, leaning against him. She looked up, her small voice speaking words he had grown to understand over time. "Safe." "Now?" Paul nodded, brushing her hair gently. "Yes, safe now." Mira rested her hand on Paul's arm. Her eyes held gratitude, trust, and relief. Though words were scarce between them, the feeling was clear. They were no longer strangers. They were a small family, united not by blood, but by care, courage, and shared struggle. As night fell, Paul stepped outside the cave, listening for any distant sound of patrols. The stars shone brightly above, and the hills stretched in peaceful silence. He felt a sense of quiet triumph. They had survived. They had stood together, facing danger without fear, and had found safety. Inside the cave, Mira whispered to Lena, telling her stories of hope and survival. Lena listened, eyes wide, imagining a future where she could run freely without fear. Paul smiled quietly, watching the bond between mother and daughter grow stronger each day. The next morning, Paul led them to a small plateau overlooking the valley below. From there, they could see the colony in the distance. The patrols were still active, but the distance and terrain made it impossible for them to track Paul and his new family. "We are safe here," Paul said, kneeling to Lena's level. He held her small hands gently. "And you can stay with us." Mira looked at him, her eyes reflecting a deep gratitude. She nodded, then touched her heart lightly, a gesture she had used many times before to show thanks and trust. Paul understood perfectly. For the first time in weeks, they all felt a sense of peace. The fear of being discovered had lifted, replaced by hope and security. Lena laughed softly, running a small circle around Paul and Mira, her energy returning after weeks of fear and hunger. Paul watched her, feeling a profound sense of purpose. He had started with a simple act of kindness, feeding a starving child. Now, that act had grown into something much larger: protection, teaching, and forming a bond that transcended differences. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in orange and purple hues, Paul, Mira, and Lena sat together on the plateau. They watched the colony far below, the lights tiny in the distance, and Paul felt a quiet strength within himself. Humanity's power was not only in its numbers or technology, but in its courage, compassion, and willingness to protect the vulnerable. That night, as they settled into their cave, Paul felt something he had not felt in years: hope. Hope for Lena, who could now grow up safely. Hope for Mira, who could rebuild a sense of security. And hope for himself, knowing that small acts of kindness could create lasting bonds, even in the face of danger. The fire burned low. The stars above shone brightly, and Paul knew one truth: they had faced danger, hardship, and fear, but together they had overcome. For Lena, Mira, and Paul, this was more than survival. It was a new beginning, a life built on trust, courage, and human kindness. A life where compassion had won over fear, and where even the smallest act of care could change everything. And as the night settled over the hills, Paul held Mira and Lena close, knowing that they were safe, together, and ready to face whatever the future might bring, side by side, with courage in their hearts and hope guiding their steps.